I'm here today with Joe Jordan, J.R. Jordan. He's just updated his book on the director Robert Wise, and it's fantastic. We're going to spend some time together today talking about it. How are you today, Joe?
Doing well, John. How are you?
I'm doing great. We missed the hurricane and only lost power for a little bit today.
Good.
Yeah. Let's just jump right in. And Joe, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background?
Certainly, yes. I've been writing about the golden age of Hollywood for several years now. In addition to writing a book about Robert Wise, I've also written a book regarding William Castle, the famous Schlockmeister. He's most popular probably for the horror B films of the late 1950s, early 1960s. And this time of the year with Halloween approaching is definitely the most popular time for William Castle. So the book I wrote about William Castle, it covers all 56 films directed by him. At this point in time, I'm currently in the process of finishing my third book. The manuscript is about 90% complete. Writing has been wonderful. I think the best part of writing is the research. There's so much to discover. In my case, in order to write about a particular film, multiple viewings are required, and I always discover something new about said film with each new viewing. Naturally, some films are more enjoyable to watch than others, but what a treat this has been.
Fantastic. Are you in California or Florida?
Yes, I am. I'm in Northern California. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, how did you first become interested in writing about Robert Wise? What drew you to this great director?
So the Robert Wise book, I should probably start off by saying that the Robert Wise book is dedicated to my father, who actually passed away in July of this year.
Sorry to hear that.
Fortunately, he was able to enjoy the book, upon its publication. As I was growing up, my father spoke highly of the Sand Pebbles. And the day the two of us took in a screening of the film, it's one that I'll never forget. In addition to the Sand Pebbles, I was really amazed when I viewed Robert Wise's filmography for the first time. He was quite versatile. He directed motion pictures of several different genres. So as I reviewed this filmography, I knew I would very much enjoy the process of researching these films further. One thing about my book, it's not a biography of Robert Wise. That's the most common interpretation. The title pretty much says it all. Robert Wise, The Motion Pictures. The book offers a film-by-film analysis of Wise's 40 directorial efforts. Now, of course, one will find significant biographical details when reading about Robert Wise's motion pictures, but it's really not a biography. It's more of like a film-by-film analysis.
Right, that's another thing. When I read your book, I thought, well, you're doing an expanded, in-depth version of what I do for my podcast. I just go over a movie and tell what happened and throw in little facts, but not as much depth and background as you did. So I think my audience is really going to like this book because it should be right in what they're listening to.
Excellent.
Robert Wise worked his way up, and he was successful at each step as he went through. How do you think working with Orson Welles, who was notorious for leaving projects unfinished, for example, on the Magnificent Ambersons 1942, set Wise up for success on future projects?
Yes, Orson Welles, what a very interesting character. He was the kind of guy who had high expectations. Robert Wise worked very hard to ensure that he would never let Orson Welles down. If anybody expected to work for Mr. Welles, it was imperative that they knew their stuff, that they knew their craft. In the case of Robert Wise, editing, it's a challenging profession. And to be an editor of Citizen Kane, which Robert Wise was, one of the greatest motion pictures of all time, it was not an easy task, but Robert Wise pulled it off nevertheless. So Welles was impressed and actually hired Wise to be an editor of his next picture, the one of which you speak, The Magnificent Ambersons. At one point, however, during the production of The Magnificent Ambersons, Welles took off for Brazil. in the middle of the production. So Wise was actually called upon to direct part of the film. And, in the process, so much experience was gained. A couple years later, Wise was asked to replace Gunther von Fritsch as director of 1944's The Curse of the Cat People. Now, The Curse of the Cat People, it was originally directed by Gunther von Fritsch, but what happened was they went over budget and they fell way behind schedule. So Gunther von Fritsch was dismissed and Robert Wise was brought in to basically finish what von Fritsch had started. He was ready for the task, I think, because of the fact that Robert Wise had been groomed under, Orson Welles' guidance. He was ready to take the reins of, The Curse of the Cat People, the production of The Curse of the Cat People. And as a result, he was quite successful. It is his directorial debut. Now, of course, Robert Wise didn't see the project through from the very beginning, but I think one could consider The Curse of the Cat People to be his directorial debut because he was able to oversee a lot of it.
Okay, fantastic. This is not on the list that I sent you, but how did you get in contact with Gavin MacLeod for your forward?
So I went through his agent. I was able to obtain contact information, for his agent. Sent the request, and the agent got back to me and said, "Oh, yeah, Gavin MacLeod would be more than happy to have a conversation with you about Robert Wise." And so when Mr. MacLeod and I spoke over the phone for the first time, it was amazing how passionate he felt about Robert Wise. We had a long conversation. I didn't expect it to go as long as it did. But gosh, what an experience being able to speak with him and learn about his admiration for such a great man.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. I just finished The Body Snatcher, 1945. The directing, camera work, lighting, and it created a constant sense of like an eerie foreboding. What about Mr. Wise's background prepared him for this kind of work?
So in 1939, RKO Radio Pictures, they released a film entitled The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Robert Wise happened to be one of the editors of that picture. And so when the time came for him to direct The Body Snatcher a few years later, RKO actually ended up using the same exact set that was used for The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So if you compare the two films, The Hunchback of Notre Dame with The Body Snatcher, similarities exist regarding directing, camera work, lighting. So I really believe Robert Wise used this experience to his advantage, especially because he was still, somewhat green at the time of his direction of The Body Snatcher. It was only his third film, the third film that he directed. That being said, another factor to consider when reflecting on Wise's experience as an editor is that he developed an appreciation for the precise content within a frame. So as a result, when he did become a director of motion pictures, he relied heavily on storyboards. And had he not, been an editor at the start of his career, he would not have had such extensive experience with storyboards. And so that's another thing to consider. When he was directing The Body Snatcher, he had those storyboards, but his experience as an editor made him a master of storyboards.
Okay. I was just amazed. I don't think I'd watched that film before last week or something. And I was just amazed at the ending and the last carriage scene. And I won't spoil it for everybody here, but it was an amazing shot.
Absolutely. Yeah. Highly recommended.
Yeah. Mr. Wise directed one of the greatest sci-fi films of all time, The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1961. He also directed The Andromeda Strain, and near the end of his career, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which is not probably the best Star Trek movie, but it certainly launched a chain of films. What would you say Mr. Wise's legacy in the sci-fi genre is?
So, Robert Wise, unfortunately, he's not considered to be one of the greatest sci-fi directors in the annals of American cinema. But, the films that you mentioned, especially The Day the Earth Stood Still, a film like that essentially defines the sci-fi genre, I believe. regarding Star Trek: The Motion Picture, yeah, as you said, yes, it launched a chain of films. But there were many issues which plagued the production because of his experience. However, Robert Wise was able to successfully guide the project to its bitter end. I had the opportunity to interview Doug Wise, Robert Wise's nephew. Doug Wise served as the first assistant director for Star Trek: The Motion Picture. He also contributed the introduction for my book. It's a very thoughtful introduction. Anyways, he told me that watching his Uncle Bob direct Star Trek: The Motion Picture was an experience in itself. Everybody loved him. He was evenly tempered, such a pleasant person. If Robert Wise ever had a disagreement with somebody on the set, or if like an actor didn't care for a particular line in the script, Robert Wise and that person would basically take a little walk around the stage to discuss the issue. And that usually straightened things out. The production of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, it was difficult to begin with because Paramount, the studio, they decided to begin shooting without a completed script. Now, the film had actually been pre-booked in theaters in order to provide an extra source of revenue in order for it to be produced. And so Paramount was facing this specific release date, but problems kept arising on a day-to-day basis, whether it was an issue with the photography or some other aspect of the production. One of the things that Doug Wise, being the first assistant director, one of the things that he shared with me was that he received so many revisions to the script that it became necessary for him to label the revisions with the day and the time received. Some of the actors would report to him, hey, we're not receiving these changes. So Doug Wise ended up taking the people's call sheets, stapling the changes to these sheets, and then whenever he handed them the changes, he would always require a signature. So therefore, if anybody ever tried to claim that they did not receive these script revisions, Doug was at least cleared of any wrongdoing. But it got to a point where sometimes the cast and the crew would stop filming altogether because they were simply out of material. And so what would happen was everyone would go to the stage next door. There was a table in the form of a big U shape. It was located in the center of this stage, along with many chairs. So Gene Roddenberry's people would, bring any and all script revisions to the table and then distribute these revisions to everybody who was present. The film's performers took some time to, read and review the changes. And finally, everyone would head back to the main stage and start shooting the new material. Doug Wise used the word bizarre to describe the experience. Robert Wise, his Uncle Bob, had no time to prepare. He basically did things on the fly. But that's where his experience came in handy. He was able to choreograph the scenes despite not having enough time to think things through. He relied on his previous, just like I mentioned before, he relied on his previous experience of arranging his shots on storyboards. So truthfully, I think because of Robert Wise, the Star Trek film series was launched successfully. Like you said, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, it's perhaps not the best of the series, but Robert Wise was able to get that series off to a good start, a decent start, and it paved the way for many more exciting films to come.
Right. Absolutely. It's always a mistake to start without a script. I think that goes off the rails every time they do that.
Yep.
He co-directed West Side Story, which won the Best Picture and Best Director Oscar, and The Sound of Music, which won the Best Picture and the Best Director Oscar. What is it about these two musicals that placed him in a higher category of recognition above many of the other films he's made?
So the one thing I always look at is that both films are based on popular stage productions. I had the opportunity to interview George Chakiris of West Side Story and the late Heather Menzies Urich of The Sound of Music. Both informed me that during the productions of these films, they knew they were working on projects of great magnitude. But to see these films become successful to the point where, they are still popular in this day and age, that's an amazing feat. But I think the foundation is key, just that they were stage productions. West Side Story and The Sound of Music both have had a widespread following because not only because they're successful stage productions, but the ensuing adaptations for the silver screen have simply, enhanced the experience. Like there are many people who have seen West Side Story and The Sound of Music, but these people have not had the opportunity to see it on the big screen. And for those who have not had the opportunity to see these wonderful motion pictures on the big screen, they're not going to get that special perspective of brilliant cinematography. So, for example, Daniel Pfaff, he served as the director of photography on West Side Story, and then Ted McCord served in the same capacity for The Sound of Music. They both did a phenomenal job. But one thing, I always like to point out is the opening aerial sequences of both films. They're just amazing. For West Side Story, you have these amazing, breathtaking views of Manhattan. And then for The Sound of Music, of course, you have these wonderful views of the Alps. Unforgettable. But again, to see such imagery on the big screen in an actual movie theater is to really get the most out of the experience. And, naturally, you can't do that in a stage production. So I think it just comes down to the enhancement, the ensuing adaptation. It was just such an enhancement of two stage productions that were phenomenal to begin with.
Okay, thanks. That's a good answer. Let's see. Wise directed what to me is a significant anti-war film. You've already mentioned it, The Sand Pebble, 1966. What is the legacy of this film?
So, The Sand Pebbles it was Wise's personal favorite among the 40 films in his filmography. During the early 1960s, he had read Richard McKenna's novel of the same name. And upon completion, Robert Wise immediately knew that it was a novel he wished to adapt for motion picture production. However, the executives of 20th Century Fox, they would only allow him to produce and direct this adaptation on the condition that he agreed to direct The Sound of Music. William Wyler, the great William Wyler, had been tapped to helm the production of The Sound of Music, but he dropped out. And so Darryl and Richard Zanuck, the father-son executive duo of 20th Century Fox, they presented the opportunity to Wise, and he accepted only because he was promised The Sand Pebbles for his next assignment. And so it's interesting, not everybody realizes that, but yeah, Robert Wise directed The Sound of Music primarily because it was a stepping stone to The Sand Pebbles. And yes, the Sand Pebbles is an anti-war film, absolutely. And Robert Wise was a vocal opponent of the Vietnam War. In fact, in 1971, he and his friend Mark Robeson, they formed an independent production company by the name of the Filmmakers Group, which produced anti-war pictures during the early 70s. Robert Wise's film entitled Two People, it was released in 1973. That revolves around the romance between Lindsay Wagner and Peter Fonda's characters. And Peter Fonda's character, who's named Evan Bonner, he's actually a draft dodger. And so he goes all the way to Marrakesh to avoid being apprehended by the military police because he's dodging the draft. And along the way, he meets Lindsay Wagner, and a romance blooms in the process.
Okay, excellent. I always mispronounce. I always call it The Sand Pebble instead of The Sand Pebbles. Have we talked about your favorite Robert Wise movie yet, or do you even have a favorite one?
So, like Robert Wise, my personal favorite of his films is The Sand Pebbles. And again, I just think it goes back to the connection I shared with my dad when he was alive. That my dad introduced me to that film, and just I'll never forget, the time he and I, took in a screening of that film. It was just so memorable. It's over 3 hours, but for the entire production, I was captivated from start to finish.
All right, fantastic. What did I forget to ask you about Mr. Wise?
So I know there was a subject of film noir that Wise had made some great film noir early on, such as like Born to Kill, Blood on the Moon.
Let's skip that question.
Yeah. So the main thing that people have confessed to me after reading my book is that they had no idea Robert Wise directed the films that they've known about for many years. And that includes, film noir such as Blood on the Moon or The Setup. They knew of these films. They just didn't know that Robert Wise was the director. And then once they read my book, they realized just how many productions he was affiliated with, how many films he directed. To them, Robert Wise has just been associated primarily with, huge productions such as West Side Story and The Sound of Music. But once they read, my book, they see the big picture. Perhaps the genre of film noir, it should be Robert Wise's greatest legacy, but it is not, but hopefully as more and more people read the book and learn more about Robert Wise, they'll be able to better understand the many contributions this man, made to cinema.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, sorry, I skipped that question. I don't know how, but I took a film noir photography class last year out in New Mexico, and Alan K. Rody from the Film Noir Foundation had recommended the films, and Blood on the Moon was one of the recommendations, because just the horses set against the backdrop of the snow and the visual aspects of it were so beautiful.
Absolutely.
Great movie.
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, he should be the king of noir, and let's see, let's going fast. It's only been about 20 minutes, but now where can people get your book, and where can they follow you on social media?
So I think the best place to obtain a copy of the book, just go online. Amazon and Barnes & Noble appear to be the most popular sites. People can visit my personal website. It's wisecastle.net. Wise is in Robert Wise, and then Castle, WilliamCastle.net. So wisecastle.net.
Okay. All right. That's fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on today. This went really fast. I mean, you know so much about Mr. Wise. There wasn't a lot of fumbling around and stuff. And sorry for my technical problems, but I really appreciate it. And I'll be back in touch with you soon before this goes out.
Okay, John, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Okay, thanks. Talk to you in the future. Bye-bye.
Bye.